Hey guys, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. If you're new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we're going to talk about a Wild West legend. If you know anything about the Wild West and some of the historic figures of the Wild West, then you probably have heard of this person before. Today we're going to talk about Billy the Kid and his story. And there's a lot of people that believe that Billy was not killed in the 1880s the way the history books tell you it had happened. They believe he escaped. And we're going to go over some details about Billy, his life, and why he was famous and infamous, and go over some of that. So, to start off with, it is said that Billy was born September 17th of 1859 in New York City in the Irish slums to Catherine and Patrick McCarty. So it said he was baptized as Patrick Henry McCarty, and his exact date of birth has been disputed, but it appears all sources make it look like it was sometime in the later part of 1859. So it looks like everyone agrees upon that. His father, Patrick McCarty, he died when Billy was younger, and his mother, Catherine, then took him and his younger brother, Joseph, to Indianapolis, where she then met William Henry Harrison Antrim. And she eventually marries him in 1873, but this is after they first lived in Indianapolis, then Wichita, Kansas, and then on to Santa Fe, I believe, where they got married. And then shortly after that, I believe, they moved to Silver City, New Mexico. So both of the kids, Billy and his brother Joseph, they were old enough that they were witnesses to the marriage. And the marriage was in March 1st of 1873. So, like I said, shortly after the marriage in Santa Fe, they moved to Silver City, New Mexico. And Catherine, Billy's mom, died shortly after that from tuberculosis. And it was said that William at that point abandoned the boys and left them as orphans. So Catherine had died on September 17th of 1874. I believe Catherine and William had only been married just over a year at that point, year and a half or so. And at this point, Billy is 15 when his mother dies, and like I mentioned, he's an orphan at this point. He does manage to get a room in a boarding house in exchange for work on the property, and I guess that gave him a place to live. Nothing's mentioned about his brother Joseph at this point, so I'm not sure. I know he was younger. I don't know what came of him at this point. But on September 16th of 1875, Billy was caught for stealing food. And then 10 days later, he and a friend had stole some clothes and a couple of pistols from a Chinese laundry. So at this point, Billy was jailed, but he escaped jail 2 days later. And he had located his stepfather around this time, and he lived with him for a short period of time before he was thrown out. But from his stepfather, he had stolen some clothes and some guns. So Billy then fled to southeastern Arizona, where he worked as a ranch hand for Henry Hooker. And it was here that Billy became acquainted with a criminal named John Mackey, and they stole some horses together. And around this time, Billy became known as Kid Antrim due to his slight build, his youthful looks, and his clean-shaven appearance. And then on August 17th of 1877, Billy was in a saloon, and he got in an argument with Francis P. Windy Cahill, who was a blacksmith in the area. So Cahill had threatened and bullied Billy on many occasions before this point, and this day apparently was no different. So Cahill threw Billy to the floor in the saloon, and he was, I don't know if he was fighting with Billy, but anyhow, they were wrestling around on the ground. Billy was struggling because Cahill was a bigger man. Billy was, a pretty slim, youthful looking, like a kid. And they wrestled around for Billy's revolver. And Billy was somehow able to get it away from him enough to fire it at Cahill during the struggle. And Cahill died the next day. So witnesses had said that Billy had no choice but to use his gun. So Billy fled town, and then he came back a few days later, and he was promptly arrested at this point. So he was put in the Fort Grant guardhouse, I think, awaiting the sheriff to come for him. And he escaped the guardhouse and stole a horse, and he made his getaway. And I think he headed off towards the New Mexico direction again. So some Apaches eventually caught up with him, and they stole his horse, and then he was walking at that point. And he did eventually make it to a settlement where a gang member, John Jones, had lived. And I believe that John Jones was a member of the James Evans gang, I believe. So John's mother nursed Billy back to health at this point, and eventually Billy makes his way to Lincoln County, New Mexico. And Billy gained employment on a ranch that was owned by John Henry Tunstall. And Tunstall and his lawyer partner, Alexander McSween, they were opponents to this alliance and monopoly of these cattle ranchers and dry goods suppliers, and these three guys that basically ran this monopoly in the area. They were Lawrence Murphy, James Dolan, and John Riley. So those three men had complete control over Lincoln County at this point. In 1878, the partner, McSween, had owed one of these three men, Dolan, $8,000. So Dolan had sent Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady to take $40,000 worth of property and cattle from Tunstall and McSween. So Tunstall had sent Billy to move some of the more prized horses and cattle and probably get them off of the property when the sheriff came. And Sheriff Brady showed up with a posse to seize Tunstall's property and basically eliminate the competition for these other three men that had the monopoly control of the town. So on February 18th of 1878, Tunstall had rode to meet the sheriff and his men, who he already heard were already on his property. So he rides out to meet the sheriff, and one of the posse members shoots Tunstall in the chest, and he falls off of his horse. Then another posse member took Tunstall's gun and shot him in the head with it. So at this point, Tunstall lays there dead. So Tunstall's murder erupted into what would be known as the Lincoln County War. And Billy and another of Tunstall's ranch workers, Dick Brewer, they swore affidavits against Sheriff Brady and his posse members and obtained murder warrants against the sheriff and his men by the Justice of the Peace of Lincoln County, John Wilson. So now both factions were after each other. And Billy was captured by Sheriff Brady, but the U.S. Marshal Robert Weidenman and a detachment of I think it was U.S. cavalry soldiers, they basically subdued the Sheriff Brady's guards and broke Billy out of jail. So they sided with Billy at that point, and Billy hadn't really done anything wrong at this point. His employer had just been killed by these guys that were trying to maintain their monopoly and who seemed to own the sheriff and everything. So You can see how this starts escalating really now. Billy then joined this group called the Regulators, who sided with Tunstall and McSween. And they do end up capturing two of the sheriff's posse members that were responsible for Tunstall's murder. And they were shot as they tried to escape, and those two posse members died. So a couple weeks later, the Regulators were able to ambush Sheriff Brady and his deputies, and it was an all-out gun battle, and Sheriff Brady and Deputy George Hindman were killed. So 3 days later, the Regulators were then ambushed themselves, and Dick Brewer and Buckshot Roberts were killed from Billy's side. So remember, the county was controlled by these three men's interests so far up to this time. So no time really was wasted on getting warrants out for Billy and the two others that had survived this battle with Sheriff Brady. But the Regulators group had swelled to a group of like 50 to 60 men by this point, on the side of justice as they saw it. And on July 14th, they all went to the McSween residence where Billy and many others were, and they were hanging out there. And the new sheriff, had sent sharpshooters to kill McSween and his men when they had left and gone into a saloon in town. So the sharpshooters come into the saloon by this new sheriff, George Pepins, and one of these sharpshooters is killed at the saloon. So Pepins' men were retreated, and they tried to send for military reinforcement from close by Fort Stanton, and Colonel Nathan Dudley refused to intervene. I think he eventually came to town with his soldiers, but he didn't want to get involved on either side here. And so a few days later, on July 19th, all of McSween's supporters, you remember McSween was Tunstall's partner, so he's the only one that's alive now. So all of his supporters are gathered at his house, and Pepin's deputy sheriff is sent there to the McSween house, and he set fire to the McSween house with him, and I guess there was a couple other guys with him, or a group of guys. So they set the ranch house on fire. It turns into an inferno, and Billy and McSween and all the men on their side that were gathered there had to try to escape and then try to shoot it out as they're coming out, and bullets are raining down on them. And the sheriff's man, Robert Beckwith, had shot and killed Alexander McSween as he made his exit from the burning house. Then Billy shot and killed Beckwith. So at that point, I believe Billy got away again, and some of the Regulators got away, but some of them were killed. And on August 5th of 1878, a couple of weeks later, Billy and three of the survivors of this battle were at the Mescalero Indian Agency when the agency bookkeeper, Morris Bernstein, was murdered. And all four of them were indicted for murder. When conflicting evidence came out, though, it said that he had actually been killed by Constable Atancio Martinez. So with this evidence that came out, all the indictments were dismissed, except Billy's for some reason. And then a couple months later, on October 5th of 1878, this new territorial governor, Lew Wallace, he issued an amnesty proclamation to anyone involved in that Lincoln County War after Tunstall's murder, but it excluded anyone that had been indicted of a crime, which at this point Billy is still indicted of a crime because they didn't dismiss his indictment. So now this is where a lot of the Billy the Kid fans feel he was definitely wronged. If his indictment was dismissed like the other three, he would have also had a pardon too. But he didn't get one. So on February 18th of 1879, Billy and a friend, Tom O'Folliard, they had witnessed a killing of attorney Houston Chapman by the Jesse Evans gang. And Billy offered the governor via letter some information on the murder if he could get a pardon. And Governor Lew Wallace agreed to a secret meeting, and that was set up. And then they worked out a deal, and Billy kind of allowed himself to be captured by a different sheriff, and then he was housed in the jail for his protection, and he was housed in the jail during these court proceedings, and he testified, and he did the things he needed to do, awaiting his pardon. So after the court proceedings were done, they didn't let him out of jail. And after many weeks of this, he felt that he had been double-crossed. And at this point, he felt he had no other choice, and so he escaped again. And, he felt, I'm not going to get my pardon, so why am I going to sit here in jail? So he escapes, he gets away, and he stays out of the limelight for quite a while, because this was early 1879 when he escaped, and it's not until early 1880 that he kind of pops up again. But he avoided being on the law's radar until January 10th of 1880. So in Hargrove's Saloon in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, there was a newcomer in town named Joe Grant. And he was looking for Billy. And it was said that he was there to kill Billy. And Billy was warned of Grant's intentions. And Billy saw Grant at the saloon. And he had said to him, as he walked up to him, he kind of admired his pistol and asked if he could look at it. And so Grant hands his pistol over to him. And before he gave the revolver back, Billy noticed there were only 3 cartridges in the cylinders. So Billy positioned the pistol so that the next shot would land on an empty chamber. And he handed the gun back to Grant. And then Grant suddenly realized, I think, that this was Billy, and he pointed the gun at his face, and he pulled the trigger on Billy. And, of course, no shot fired since it was positioned on an empty cylinder. So you probably know what's going to happen here. Then Billy drew his own weapon, and he shot Grant in the head. And a reporter from the Las Vegas Optic after this was quoted as Billy saying, "It was a game of 2, and I got there first." So a lot of people that were involved in this or saw this, felt that it was self-defense on Billy's part because he didn't draw first, he didn't pull the trigger first or anything like that, but Billy survived. So soon, though, Governor Lew Wallace put a $500 bounty on Billy's head. And on December 23rd of 1880, Billy and some others were captured at Stinking Springs. And at this point, then, Billy sent Governor Wallace some more letters, again asking for pardons, and Governor Wallace refused to intervene at this point. So many regulators were then tried, and only Billy was convicted of Sheriff Brady's murder or with anything that had to do with the Lincoln County War. He was the only conviction. In April of 1881, Billy was tried and convicted of murder. So he was sentenced to hang the next month in May. So after sentencing, he was moved to Lincoln, New Mexico, and he was held on the top floor of the courthouse under guard. So on the evening of April 28th of 1881, when Sheriff Pat Garrett was out of town on some other duties, Deputy Bob Olinger took 5 of the other prisoners across the street for a meal, and he left Billy alone with Deputy James Bell. Billy said he needed to go to the restroom, and so James took him to the outhouse. And on the way back from the outhouse, Billy was in the lead, so James could follow him. And Billy got around the corner of the building first, and he finished slipping his hands out of, I guess, one of the sides of the handcuffs. And as the deputy came around the corner, Billy beat him with the loose end of the handcuffs and managed to get his revolver out, get the deputy's revolver out of his holster, and he fatally shot him with it. So Billy still had his leg shackles on, and he broke into the sheriff's office in the courthouse building there, and he found a shotgun, and he waited for the other deputy across the street to respond to the gunshot. So it sounds like Billy was in an upper floor. So Billy waited at that upstairs window of the sheriff's office, and when Deputy Olinger responded from across the street, Billy yelled out the window to him, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get." And when Deputy Olinger looked up, Billy shot him and killed him. So then Billy got out of his leg shackles and he took a horse and he got out of town. So now the New Mexico governor, Lew Wallace, put a $500 bounty on Billy's head. And on July 14th of 1881, Sheriff Pat Garrett had heard that Billy was near Fort Sumner, New Mexico. So the sheriff left Lincoln with two of his deputies and headed to Fort Sumner. So the sheriff questioned one of Billy's known friends there, Pete Maxwell. They talked for hours until nearly midnight, and they were still sitting in this dark room talking when it was said that Billy entered the dark room. It was said that since the room was so dark, Billy could not see who his friend was talking with and asked, "Quienes? Quienes?" which is Spanish for "who is it?" Supposedly, Sheriff Pat Garrett drew his revolver because he recognized his voice, and he shot twice at the man in the dark, hitting him once in the chest, and the man soon died. So shortly after the killing, the coroner's jury of 6 people agreed that it was Billy the Kid, and he was buried the very next day. So it was all rushed through real quick. So 5 days later, Sheriff Pat Garrett is in Santa Fe to collect his $500 reward for the bounty of Billy. But the governor refused to pay it. So it doesn't say exactly why the governor refused to pay it at that point. So a few different New Mexico cities, they did raise some money for the sheriff, and he was given about $7,000. And then about a year later, the state of New Mexico, I guess it was a territory of New Mexico at that time, actually did pay him his $500. So over time, a legend has grown out of this that it was not Billy the Kid that was shot in the dark that night. Rumors of a cover-up came about. If Sheriff Pat Garrett, shot the wrong man in the dark, this could be a big problem for him. And other people also claim that Billy had escaped and was not the man that was killed that night. And, nothing much came of the situation for many years. But even one of his deputies, one of Sheriff Garrett's deputies, had said that it was not Billy, and he wondered why the body was buried so fast the next day and everything. So, but nothing would really come of this. Sheriff Pat Garrett would die, I believe, in a shootout in 1908. And that's where the story ended for a long time. I believe there were other people through the years that claimed to be Billy the Kid, and things had been disproven. But in 1948, I believe it was, a Texas man, I believe he lived in Hicko, Texas. His name was Ollie Roberts, and he was also known as Brushy Bill. He claimed that he was really Billy the Kid, and he asked for a pardon from the current governor of New Mexico at that point. The governor dismissed the claims, and Brushy Bill died, I believe, a couple years later. So I believe he had been interviewed and he had talked to quite a few people and things like that before he died. So a team of experts were now on this claim. And, like I said, numerous others had claimed to be Billy and had been disproven. And as they worked through all of Brushy Bill's claims, they were all eventually verified. Then they did a statistical facial recognition analysis. It doesn't say when that was done. I don't know if they were talking this is done later on with computer software or if we re-verified this with computer software, but a statistical facial recognition was done comparing pictures of Ollie Roberts to Billy the Kid, and it came back that they were in fact the same man. So they determined that Ollie Roberts, or Brushy Bill, he also had too many matching scars with correct stories to go with them, and he also had too much knowledge that only Billy would have known. So we don't really know at this point, but people have their thoughts one way or another. So, did Sheriff Pat Garrett accidentally shoot the wrong man in the dark and try to cover it up to save his hide? Did Billy really get away? What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and like and subscribe if you like these kind of stories.